Welcome back, everybody. My name is Jeremy Norfus with Speakeasy Studios. We're here with Patrick Price. We're here to actually introduce his new podcast, getting to know a little bit more about Patrick, his motivation for starting the podcast, and really what you can expect as a listener. How are you, Patrick?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I am doing well, no complaints. So obviously, as I said, we're here to talk about your podcast today, and it has been somewhat of a journey to get to this point. Recording a couple of episodes, going back and forth on some things on the back end, but really just wanted to get a feel for how did we get to this point? What made you want to even start a podcast?
I didn't. If you remember, this was kind of a suggestion by a mutual friend, and it wasn't until I really started thinking about it after that initial suggestion that I started getting kind of serious about it. It's like, well, what are the possibilities to do this, and what would I even talk about? I mean, what would it be? And of course, our initial meeting was so far off the beaten path from where this is now. We came in with a completely different idea, but where we ended up is here where it is now. And I'm very happy and I think, initially going in with one idea, this one thought process of what we were going to do, until we actually got in the studio and recorded those first two tests. And we saw how it took on a kind of a life of its own, and it made sense. It was like, wait a second.
Agreed.
This is something more than what I'd envisioned, and it's better.
I agree wholeheartedly. And even going back before that, we initially had our first meeting. So actually, before I go into that, do you mind giving a little bit about your background? And then that'll actually dovetail into the story perfectly.
So my background, it's tough to just pigeonhole any one thing. I've got a pretty diverse business background. The initial idea, I mean, ultimately what I did or what I do or what I've done, I've spent the last 21 years in the mortgage industry as a mortgage banker, working for a couple different companies. I moved here recently from Hawaii, where I was there for about 20 years and running a mortgage company over there. And then also owned a scuba diving company when the big, financial crisis happened. It was like, well, we couldn't do any loans. So what are we going to do? What am I going to do with myself? So I decided to go teach scuba at, one of the local dive shops there. And then that turned out to not be so fun. And so I went to work for another one, and that was really not fun. I said, I can do it better myself. I have my own, my own business experience. I've had several startups that were successful and everything. So I said, I know what I'm doing. Let me get in the bit and start my own scuba company, which I did. And if I could make a recommendation about anybody thinking about getting in the scuba business, don't. Okay. So, but like anything you do in life, you learn from those experiences, good or bad. You're going to take away what you're going to take away from it. And you should, if it's a bad experience, you're supposed to learn from that as well. I definitely did. And that's why I'm giving that advice to anybody who's thinking, I want to go start a scuba diving business or whatever. But I always, once the mortgage market started coming back in Hawaii, then we started up with that again. And that's kind of how I got back into it. And then made the decision back in 21 to move over here, come to the mainland, done with the Hawaii experience and all that silliness over there. And so came here, love it here. It's great. Met some great people and everything. And the other part of this is one of my hobbies. So aside from scuba diving and surfing and other things that I do, I've always been into watches. And when I say watches, well, it was always watches. When I was a little kid, I think I got my first watch when I was like eight years old. I think my grandparents gave me one. It was like a Timex or something like that. And I loved it. It was great. Wore that sucker everywhere, and every few years or whatever, I would either get another one, and when I was old enough to have, saved up enough money, I'd buy my own and do whatever. And all the way through high school, I remember buying my first dive watch after I got, certified to dive and stuff. And so watches I was always kind of fascinated with time. I was fascinated with wristwatches, or timepieces, however you want to call them. And I always dreamed about having a real nice one day. Well, when I got my first real nice one, it was nice. It was great. All right. Awesome. Well, I wore that thing for
Well,
years.
let me ask, what was your
It was,
first
it was a
wristwatch?
Rolex Submariner.
Okay.
Yeah. And it wasn't anything fancy. It was just a Rolex Submariner because I was a diver. And I said, that's what I want to wear. And so I had that for a few years, and then I sold that one eventually. And so I would kind of recycle, through the watches. I would wear it for a while, and then I would say, okay, this is okay, I'm going to sell this one, use that money, put it together with some other money, and buy something better. And so that kind of was just a hobby, a hobby that ultimately became kind of an obsession. And ultimately, after coming here and meeting a bunch of other people that I know that have the same hobby, and realizing, wow, there's actually money to be made doing this if you're smart, if you're a business person and you've got a business mind, and you learn the ins and outs of buying and selling of that, you can actually do pretty well with it. So that's what I did. I said, well, I'm going to do that because I enjoy it. It's fun. It's a way to take something that's a passion of mine and turn it into a business. So having done that, that's where someone asked me, our mutual friend asked me, so have you ever thought about doing a podcast about your watches? And I've seen podcasts about watches, and I'm sorry, that's not for me. I'm not a watch geek. I love watches. I absolutely love them. I'm interested in them. I like to, I see somebody wearing one that's cool. I'm like, hey, what's the story behind it? What are you wearing? That kind of thing. But I don't want to know about what movement is in it. I'm not all into horology, into that part of the watch community. It's like I do know the basics about different models and things like that, but I'm not all about, I need to know this and that and the history of every little piece and everything. It's like, no, I look at it. It looks good on my wrist. It looks good on your wrist. And it makes me feel good when I'm wearing one, and it makes my customers feel good when I sell them one. And that's really the reward. That's really what I get out of it. So
well, it's funny enough. So you do have one of the most diverse and interesting backgrounds of people that I know. But weirdly enough, I didn't know about the scuba. And then probably it wasn't until 6 months we've known each other for close to a year now.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't until 6 months in that I knew that you actually were a mortgage broker. When I banker, excuse me. Yep. Initially, when I met you, I thought it was only the watches.
No.
So going back to that conversation of us starting the podcast and that meeting that we initially had, it was going back and forth. Okay, how do we highlight what you do and how do we make it fun? And initially, we were going to make that podcast that you just talked about watches.
Right.
So I did a little bit of research before we had a scheduled meeting. You came to the studio. We're going to talk and brainstorm. Okay, how can we make this actual podcast, and how do we make it entertaining?
Remember, during our initial discussion before we met at the studio was, how the heck do we make this interesting?
Well, so yes. And part of that research that I did was listening to other podcasts. So those horology podcasts, people that are talking about different watches, and they had a watch of the day that they would highlight.
Right.
They would talk about the different movements. How is this different than the other watches? Give you some history behind it. And it was just extremely boring. Even if you were learning something, it was extremely boring. And as my wheels are turning, okay, Patrick's a very interesting guy. Maybe we can take the content of what they're doing and make it interesting, but maybe we add. So I was just kind of going all over the place. How do we make this content interesting? So when we met with one another, I had a sheet of paper that I had typed up different names, maybe a description of the podcast, and you didn't even look at the paper. We started talking, and it was an hour and a half meeting. We scheduled to meet for probably 20 minutes, and it turned into an hour and a half. And we ended up just throwing that piece of paper away.
Yep.
And not to say that we used that idea that we immediately came up with that day, but it opened our minds up to so many other different possibilities of what we can talk about on this podcast and who we could relate to.
Right. Yeah. It was funny because when we thought about it, when we got to talking, I remember you tried to hand me that list, and I said, hang on to that thing. I said, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And I remember saying to you, who do you think owns watches? Who do you think are into watches, men or women, more? Right.
I said guys.
And you said guys, right? And I said, right. What else do guys like besides watches?
And then just started listening to a bunch of things: cars, sports, fighting, combat, all of these guns.
Right? Everything. So that is what led to that hour and a half conversation, because all of a sudden ideas started coming and started clicking, and we're writing and, coming up with all this stuff. The only bummer was that we didn't video that initial meeting. That would have been a great,
That would have been
great
awesome.
video.
The behind the scenes of how this all got started.
So it's funny because we filmed the initial podcast. We filmed that one test to see, and that was actually what was going to become the first episode, which is now lost forever. But but it was neat because going into that, we had one idea. We kind of had a track of where we were going to go, and I always wanted to keep this pretty free form. I didn't want this to be an interview with me asking these guests questions and following an outline and doing whole thing. I didn't want to go there. I wanted the guests to lead us. I wanted the conversation to get led by the guests to take us wherever it took us. And that's what happened. That's what ultimately ended up happening. And the really, the huge epiphany that I had was, this isn't about watches. This has nothing to do with watches. Yeah, we're all three sitting here with a nice watch on our wrist, but we're not even talking about watches. We're talking about us. We're talking about guys and all the shared experiences that we've had in our lives that we didn't realize we shared until we started talking. And pretty soon, we got one guy saying, hey, I did this. And the other guy going, I did that too. And I'm sitting back going, holy crap, so did I, and it just rolled. It just flowed. There wasn't any, I didn't need to push. I didn't need to lead. I didn't need to do anything. At some point I'd ask a question for just a little more about that, something that they said. And it took on a life of its own, which is wonderful, which is exactly what I was hoping for. It was just funny how this whole thing was led in by watches and then ended up not being about watches at all.
Well, and another thing that I want to throw out there as a disclaimer is a lot of the topics we talk about are masculine, but it's not men only. You will hear women on this podcast, but the topics do tend to be a bit masculine. So I do want to throw that out there just to start out. Now,
this would be called the man cave if we could, but or the man show.
But going into what you said before, where you didn't want this podcast to be so rigid, you want it to be free forming. And we actually came up with you came up with the idea, and what we're actually executing right now is to make this more of a traveling show. Do you mind talking a bit more about that?
Yeah. So, where most of your podcasts are, if they're the video type where it's a visual experience as well as the listening experience, most of them are done in a static studio. And I know when we initially said we're going to do that, we said we were going to do it in a static studio. Well, what we found out was we take up a bit of space with all the lighting and the cameras and the other things that we have to have. There's not a lot of room for us. And even right now where we're sitting, we're surrounded in this huge room. We're in Frank's, gym here, which is awesome. We got all this room around us. But if the audience could see what's off camera, how much, they see this over here, but they don't see all the rest of the stuff. There's a lot of stuff.
And people, not just us, the people that you see on camera.
Yeah, we've got our great engineers with us again. And so all of us crammed in a little 10 by 10 booth does not work, so we're a little more spread out now. We're still closer together than I would probably prefer, but we're working this out. We'll eventually get to that point. But, yeah, I just was thinking about it after watching the first video, and I'm thinking that's really cool and everything, but it's kind of limiting because we're having to think about where are we going to do this? And I remember we were having just conniptions trying to figure out what can we do that we could fit in? We're talking about having 3 to 4 guests at a time, and me, you, or anybody else that's in the room, and then all of our stuff. So what would happen? Well, then I started thinking, as I visited people's places of business for whatever reason, going to get my hair cut or going to do this, that, or that, and seeing the cool places of business that they had and saying, this guy's got a great story. He's something that I think people would want to hear on our show. And this is such a cool place of business. It just looks so aesthetically pleasing. We could do it here. And that's when I approach you with that. I say, what do you think about, we do this on location everywhere all the time, and let people see these people's businesses. Because, one of the main things that I want to do with this podcast is to promote local area businesses, entrepreneurs, people like that. So obviously we're not going to go to the guy that works out of his house. That's not fun. But people that might have a brick and mortar business somewhere and go there and say, hey, what's that look like? Oh, that's cool.
And I remember when you initially threw the idea at me, immediately it was a yes, because it was a win-win for both sides.
Yeah.
Obviously, it gives us an amazing location to shoot the footage and shoot the content, but also it gives that business owner a chance to highlight their business and actually tell people about their business.
100%.
Otherwise, or people otherwise would never know about their place of business or whatever it may be.
Right.
So it was truly a win-win.
Yeah. So that was a big thing. And it also helped us out because now we could be flexible.
Mhm.
We could be hostile, mobile, and versatile. We could go wherever we needed to go. I remember discussed doing some maybe on location stuff in the future, go to car shows or go here, there, or wherever. But it wasn't the main focus, it wasn't our main
Mhm.
idea. And I think now that we've had time to think about it a lot and say, well, wait a minute. Why are we trying to put ourselves in a static location? I
Mhm.
mean, yeah, whatever. But I mean, if we can go out into the public and,
Mhm.
like you said, showcase somebody's business, it also is a big deal for us because all we need is to take our stuff and show up there and set it up there and do the whole thing. And it gives us a new location and something that looks better.
And a lot more exposure.
Yeah.
Because if we're at that static location, we're really just tapping into that local area and our networks.
Yeah.
If we're able to go to these other different locations, you're going to have people that, oh, what'd you guys shoot at your shop the other day?
Right.
Okay, I saw you guys on YouTube. What exactly was that?
Yeah.
So it just opens up the doors to so many other different things.
Yeah. I think I'm excited about it. I think it's gonna work out well. I think that I met someone else today, or didn't meet him. I met him for the second time today, but I had a chance to talk to him about it. And he's got a great business, a new location. It's stunning to look at it. And I told him about the opportunity. I said, I'd really like to have you on a podcast.
Mhm.
And I think that the audience would love it. And I think that you'd love it. You'd have a great time. And it's more exposure for your business for sure. And he didn't even hesitate. He's like, I'm there. That sounds fun. That sounds great. I said, would you mind? Could we do it here on location? He goes, 100%. I'd love that. And so I think that's going to also play into the getting the guests, really all I do is go up and talk to them and say, here's what we do.
Mhm.
Here's what I want to do. Do you want to be involved? And sure.
The only apprehension that I see is if somebody's afraid to get on camera or be behind a microphone, because it seems like a no-brainer for me.
Yeah.
This is a free commercial for your business. This is a chance for you to get exposure, meet people that you never would have met. And I think this is a great example today. We're actually, Frank Latella is going to be on a subsequent episode, but we're actually in his gym right now, highlighting his spot. So we're able to see the interior of the gym. He's going to be able to give us a tour of it. So it really is that true win-win that I mentioned before.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I'm excited also for Frank because Frank was, a couple doors down when I met him. And now he's just recently moved into this much bigger space and he knocked it out of the park when it comes to, setting this up. So it looks awesome, so I think that he's going to be pretty happy with how this all looks on camera and it's going to do some great things for him too.
Now, I think we did touch on this through our conversation so far, but kind of just wrapping up, why would somebody want to listen to this podcast? How can you set their expectations of what they're going to hear when they listen?
I have no idea why anybody would watch this at all. No, don't watch. Well, I hope that it's interesting to the listener that's into the things that we're talking about. So the average guy, the guys that we know, the guys in this room.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we're in a room full of guys. Everybody in here, we've all got something in common. I think that the first time we talked about this, you asked me what my major takeaway was. I said it was commonality. We found out that all three of us that we were talking in that one episode was we had a ton of things in common, even though we came from totally different not totally different backgrounds, but totally different areas of the country. Our upbringings weren't exactly the same, but they had a whole lot that was the same. So I think that that's one of the most interesting things about this. And of course, there's going to be fun stuff that we're not only talking about, we're going to be showing in each of these episodes as we go. Of course, there's a thread that runs through this that has to do with cars.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of us like cars, and so we'll get into that, and we'll actually showcase some cars. We'll actually see if we can get in some cars, take them for a drive, do some fun things with them. You know, just stuff like that, and not just cars. I mean, whatever comes out of the, you know, we go shooting somewhere, we'll go do this or whatever it is. We'll go to a cigar bar. I don't know, whatever floats your boat. Hopefully, it'll be fun. It'll be interesting, and people will, you know, hook into what we're doing and get something out of it. What I want people to get out of it is, yes, entertainment value, but I also hope there's some other value in it and people take away something else from this.
That's exactly what I was going to say, because I think the conversations in themselves will be entertaining enough with the guests that we have on, not just bringing on any Joe Schmo to do the show.
Right.
So I think that'll be the one piece that's going to be a huge positive. But like you just touched on, being able to take something away. So hearing about that cigar bar that we talked about before, what goes on behind the scenes, how do they actually get it to the state where it is right now?
Right.
When we have Frank on to talk about his gym, you mentioned that he was in another location before and just moved a couple doors down.
Right.
What was the thought process behind that? What's his discipline that he practices at the gym?
Right.
So really just getting people to be entertained. That would be the first thing. We got to get you here in the first place. So we want to entertain you, but we also want you to be able to take something away.
Right.
When you're in a conversation with your friends or your family, like, you know what, I was listening to Patrick Price and he had this guest on and they brought up X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And it just be a connection point, not only the people that we have on this show, but connection point with people that you're speaking with in your personal lives as well.
Right. 100%. Hopefully we're doing a bit of inspiration. And that's what we're going for. Is there's a continuing conversation that happens after they view the podcast, and hopefully we're doing something that was valuable enough to them that makes them want to tune in again to the next one.
Agreed. Any last words for the listeners?
Tune in.
I mean, I can't say it better. Thank you so much for joining me today, Patrick. Patrick Price, Jeremy Norfus with Speakeasy Studios. Be on the lookout for Patrick's podcast being released soon. Obviously, we're going to continuously get better. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you guys soon.
Awesome. Take care.